Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paddy Leerssen. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam, and I have the honor of moderating this panel today. Our topic for today is research access. And I believe this topic is something of a red thread or a cross-cutting theme across so many of the discussions we've had here today at CPDP and that we're having at other conferences. And it's that in almost our efforts to study big tech and indeed to govern big tech, researchers simply don't have access to the data they need. And data protection is a huge part of this story. It's firstly because research often require access to personal data, and there are very real risks to privacy when that data is accessed by the wrong people or used for the wrong purposes. And secondly, data protection plays a role because platforms increasingly seem to appeal to privacy and data protection as grounds to refuse data access to researchers in ways that perhaps are less convincing. And so in recent years, this debate about the balance between data access and privacy has become increasingly contentious. And especially in Europe, we're seeing a lot of exciting new initiatives and proposals trying to clarify the applicable data protection law and maybe develop new frameworks to get access to that platform data. This has been a topic we've been studying at the IViR, the Institute for Information Law, especially with a report I co-authored with my colleagues Jeff Auslos and Pim Tentaye last spring with AlgorithmWatch. But today we've brought in some other experts, some really tremendous experts on this topic, and I'm very excited to hear what they have to say about this. And we have not only legal experts here, but also empirical researchers who have actual experience in trying to get access to platform data. I'll be providing detailed bios of our speakers as we go along. But for now, I'm pleased to welcome our panelists, Christina Stump from the European Commission, Mathias Vermeulen from AWO, Bernhard Rieder from the University of Amsterdam, and Rebekah Tromble from George Washington University. So the format for today is that we're going to start with some short introductory presentations from our panelists, about 10 minutes each. And after that, we're going to have some discussion amongst the panelists, and after that, we're going to open it up for Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A, and depending on our timing, we might get to them directly, or we'll save them for the end. So that's enough for me. Without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker for today. That's going to be Christina Stump from the European Commission. Christina is the head of unit for the Media Convergence and Social Media unit with DG Connect. That puts her in charge of social media policy, as well as the Commission's policies on combating disinformation online. Christina is therefore involved in important new developments such as the Code of Practice, which we'll be hearing more about today. Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It is a great pleasure for me to be part of this really excellent panel and to be able to give you an overview what the Commission is doing in this area. So let me start by really stressing that the topic of this panel, the access for researchers to platform data, is of key importance to the European Commission. It is very important in this key area of disinformation that we have up-to-date and good research about the disinformation phenomenon, and this is obviously only possible if researchers can access the data of the platforms. So therefore, this topic was already a very important part of the Code of Practice. So this is a self-regulatory code between platforms and other players to provide solutions for the disinformation phenomenon. And one very important part of the commitment of this Code of Practice is that platforms should give data to researchers, obviously respecting the necessary conditions. When we assessed the functioning of the Code of Practice last year, then we have already also seen that while the code has done already a lot of important improvements in various areas, including this one, there are still shortcomings. And we stressed also in this assessment of the code of practice that more has to be done in this regard. Following up on this, in the European Democracy Action Plan that the European Commission published last year in December, we set out the steps for how to step up the fight against disinformation. Here, the first step that we will do from the Commission side is to issue a guidance where we set out what would be the key areas where the code of practice should be strengthened and how. And access for researchers to the platform data is one of the areas where we already stress that more work is needed. So what we will do, just also to give you a practical roadmap from the Commission side, we will indeed in the first half of this year in spring issue this guidance and explain what we would expect in this area. And then afterwards, we will convene the signatories of the code of practice. We also hope to attract new signatories, because obviously one issue is to strengthen the code, but the other is also to have a broader frame of stakeholders belonging to it. And then we expect that on the basis of the guidance, we will come up with a strengthened code of practice where this issue, the access to platforms data, should also figure among the key points. I think we will also speak about that a little bit more today, that also the another very important initiative of the Commission, the Digital Services Act, that is an overarching framework for platform regulation, also provides for a framework to give access, more access to research data for platforms, not just regarding the area of disinformation, but in all other areas where there are risks, so-called systemic risks, as the Digital Services Act calls these. And certainly, disinformation is one of the very important systemic risks today. I think only if you look at the newspapers every day, I think there can be no doubt about that after recent development. Maybe also very briefly about the interplay between the GDPR, so the data protection rules, and access to research data. Indeed, this is an important balance to keep, or an important aspect to respect. However, as we already stressed in the European Democracy Action Plan, the Commission noted there that the GDPR as such does not a priori or across the board prohibit the sharing of personal data by platforms with researchers. So while the safeguards of the GDPR need to be, of course, be taken into account, this should not be used as an excuse to prevent researchers to have access to data. And I am sure that the other distinguished panelists will also have more to say in this regard. And in particular, I am also looking forward to the colleagues that are involved in the work of EDMO. That is, in general, a very important player in this area. So EDMO has been set up recently and should also soon be also more operational with national hubs in the upcoming months. In the upcoming year. So that will be a central, the Commission sees it as a central player to facilitate more cooperation between researchers, and also to help to resolve this issue. In particular, I am looking forward to hear as well from them regarding the ongoing work that they are doing on this particular issue, basically to see how a code of conduct could facilitate these issues. So basically to give a reassuring framework to make sure that with this code of conduct respected, then researchers can have a facilitated access to platform data. That is really of key importance, and I will not dwell into this because there are much more better experts who can tell you more about this aspect. So that would be a little bit the introduction from my side. So indeed, to stress that from the Commission side, we will certainly keep this in mind and make a point in the guidance. We expect the code of practice to improve in this area, and we very much count on EDMO and the work done to provide help in this regard. And I am also in particular interested today to hear from the perspective of researchers about problems they are facing and how this could feed into the work that we are doing at the European Commission side to be helpful in our policy responses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Krisztina, for that introduction, and definitely also for that perfect little bridge to our next speaker, who is Bernhard, who is one of the real experts when it comes to studying platforms. So Bernhard Rieder is a professor, an associate professor of new media and digital culture at the University of Amsterdam. He's also a collaborator with the Digital Methods Initiative there. And Bernhard has extensive experience in studying platforms, as well as developing apps and methods for studying those platforms. For example, the NetFizz application, which many researchers have relied on over the past decade to study platforms. And Bernhard has also recently written papers on what new solutions can look like, including an article I very much like in Internet Policy Review on platform observability. And so Bernhard's going to talk to us today a bit about his experiences in trying to get access to platform data and what the future might hold here. Sorry, Bernhard, I think your microphone is... I'll just give him a few more seconds to see if we can get him back. Okay, that's maybe the assistants can help Bernhard there, and then unfortunately in the meantime we'll have to move on to one of the other speakers. In that case, maybe I'll turn the floor to Mathias Vermeulen. Mathias Vermeulen is a co-founder of and public policy director at AWO, which is a digital rights agency. He's also worked in the European Parliament, where he worked with MEP Marietje Schaake as one of our digital policy advisors. And Mathias also holds a PhD in European privacy law. And Mathias is going to talk to us today about his recent work on data access.
Thanks very much, Paddy, and thanks to the organizer of this panel as well for inviting me. Indeed, as you have been saying, like this topic has really been of a great interest to me in the past couple of years, and I'm in particular really interested in some of the GDPR aspects related to this topic. I have been drafting an article on exactly this topic for the Knight Institute at Columbia University, and how even though it is only from November of this year, it is already outdated, which only demonstrates how such a fast-moving topic this is actually. And in this article, I really wanted to take a closer look to the extent to which very general claims that say that the GDPR is preventing platforms to hand over personal data to independent researchers are actually valid. And I wanted to disentangle this argument a little bit more in detail to see where exactly the GDPR potentially can create confusion or legal uncertainty, both for platforms, but also for some of the independent academics who are really interested in using some of these data for their own research. And I also think like such a more detailed and granular analysis was really needed, because in European discussions that I have been attending, and as you said, like I have been working in the European Parliament for the past couple of years, in those conversations, usually any mentioning of how a specific activity could violate the GDPR is a guaranteed conversation stopper, as no politician or regulator would actually want to be perceived as encouraging something that would go against the GDPR. And I think Krisztina can probably very much relate to this as well. So I went systematically through the GDPR, looking first at what the legal basis could be for the sharing of personal data. And I concluded there that there are currently two legal bases that would allow such sharing currently with independent researchers. The first one is consent, but this is cumbersome for many reasons, for a number of reasons that I think Rebekah or Bernhard are much better placed to actually discuss maybe later on in the Q&A. The second one is legitimate interest, which is also tricky to a certain extent, because if platforms would rely on this provision, they would have to take a range of measures that could potentially jeopardize the independence of the researchers and the legitimacy of any resulting study, since a platform would need to be closely scrutinizing the aims, methods, and use of data by the researcher. So I was indeed very happy to see that the European Democracy Action Plan highlighted very correctly, and I think after some internal discussions and deliberations, I believe that indeed, as Krisztina already highlighted, that the Commission noted that the GDPR does not a priori and across the board, and I'm quoting now, prohibit the sharing of personal data by platforms with researchers. And so I think that general point of criticism is definitely not true, but that doesn't mean, of course, that there are no relevant GDPR considerations at all that require no further clarity, as Paddy also already mentioned in his introduction. And then I'm thinking about things such as, like, what are the relevant security provisions and protocols that need to be put in place? How do we ensure compliance with regulations regarding purpose limitation, data retention, data minimization, rights of data subjects, and including responses to data subject access requests, for instance, notification of data breaches. So needless to say that the GDPR, as we all know, it isn't the most straightforward piece of legislation that has ever been written, but it does indeed include a mechanism to provide the sort of additional clarity that many people are looking for, both from the platforms and from the independent academic side. And that is exactly Article 40 of the GDPR, which allows the creation of a mechanism to create a code of conduct that would provide a more detailed interpretation of the GDPR for the sharing of data between digital platforms and academic researchers in the EU. And I think the process of working through some of these elements that are needed to construct such a code is also likely to have a lot of value in itself, because it brings all the parties together to work through these legal questions and propose potential solutions that they each believe are important. And I do think, like, the European Commission has realized this point if you carefully read the Digital Services Act, the European Democracy Action Plan, and the Code of Practice on Disinformation all together. In particular, like Article 31.2 of the Digital Services Act will force so-called very large online platforms to provide, and I quote again, access to data to vetted researchers for the sole purpose of conducting research that contributes to the identification and understanding of systemic risks as set out in Article 26.1. And I don't expect my co-panelists or the audience to know the DSA by heart by now, but I mean, we're among wonks now, so I can actually say this, but Article 26 is actually my favorite article of the DSA, as it will force platforms to conduct risk assessments that their services pose to three big categories. One is, like, to what extent do they contribute to the dissemination of illegal content? The second one is, like, to what extent their products and services have any negative effects for the exercise of fundamental rights, in particular the right to respect for private life, freedom of expression, the prohibition of discrimination, and the rights of the child. And then finally, very important, maybe even like the most important sub-article of this Article 26, it also includes a risk assessment about the manipulation of their services, including the inauthentic use or automated exploitation of the service, which can have, like, an actual or foreseeable negative effect on the protection of public health, minors, civic discourse, or electoral processes. And of course, in that category, disinformation is going to play a very big role as well. And now researchers could have access in the future to data for studies that would scrutinize this large category of risks. And I think that's a very exciting and crucial thing to do in order to actually arrive at the point to hold companies to account, which is the ultimate goal actually of all this, right? Like, we don't care about transparency for transparency's sake, but providing access to data has this very clear goal to hold potentially platforms accountable for some of the services that they are providing. Now, the Commission has stated very explicitly in Article 31.5 of the DSA that it shall adopt delegated acts, and I quote again, that lay down the technical conditions under which very large online platforms are to share data. And that delegated act shall lay down the specific conditions under which such sharing of data with vetted researchers can take place in compliance with the GDPR. And now I think, and my co-panelists think this as well, I think, as far as I know, that we should wait to think through some of these difficult questions until the DSA actually enters into force, and to wait on the Commission to actually start the process of writing down such an implementing act. And we should be thinking about these exact topics right now. And that's where I think where the work of the EDMO will be very crucial, actually. And I think there's no one better to explain that work than Rebekah.
All right, thank you very much, Mathias. Again, a beautiful bridge to the next speaker, making my work that much easier. Teed up very well. So our next speaker is Rebekah Tromble, who's an associate professor at George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs, and she's a political scientist that focuses on political communication, and she is very much in the trenches of the data access debates here in Europe. Rebekah has experience from working on the Social Science 1 project, where she was in the European advisory body for, and now she is a member of the European Digital Media European Digital Media Observatory. That's EDMO, as I like to call it. It's a bit easier. Where she's continuing that work in trying to develop standards and in particular a code of conduct under the GDPR for data access. So Rebekah will be telling us more about that work today.
Thanks so much, Paddy. I'm also going to refer to it as the EDMO because that's simply easier. But before I talk more about the work that we're just now undertaking with the EDMO, and which Mathias really set me up to talk in more detail about, I actually want to take a step back for just a minute and explain how and why it is I came to care about these issues. As Paddy noted in introducing me, I'm an associate professor. I conduct empirical research on some of the very issues that the Digital Services Act has identified as absolutely essential to us understanding what the potential negative impacts are of the platforms on society. Doing research on digital discourse and the way that people engage on political topics with one another, looking into the spread and amplification of disinformation and other forms of and forms of illegal content, including hate speech or abuse and harassment on platforms. And so a number of years ago, as I really started to try to dig into these issues, I was initially quite optimistic about some burgeoning opportunities to, it seemed, work directly with the platforms in order to secure data and hopefully, really dig into these questions in ways that were difficult to do even through things like public APIs. So I have been part of, or I was part of the Social Science 1 initiative when it first launched back in June 2018. And at almost exactly the same time, a research team that I lead was selected by Twitter to undertake what we all refer to as the Healthy Conversations Initiative. To actually receive data from Twitter, going beyond even the public APIs, in order to look at questions about incivility, intolerance, and echo chambers, where and how they manifest, and how we might actually put in measures to try and reduce the negative impacts of these things. My experience with both initiatives has been frustrating, to say the least. I have, the difficulties that we faced with Social Science 1 have certainly been, very public, widespread, are well known, have been reported on in the media. So I won't talk too much at too much great length about those. But one of the things that I will highlight is that throughout the experience with Social Science 1, what we really understood, particularly those of us who were on advisory committees outside of the United States, is that these systems are set up to best interact with scholars, with researchers in the United States. And while we have, Europe that is charging forward and creating an appropriate regulatory environment for these things, the platforms themselves are not set up in a way yet to appropriately respond to those. And so a lot of my work has focused on ensuring that it is not just the United States that gets attention from the platform when it comes to platforms when it comes to any of these measures. But I will also note, going beyond Social Science 1, that my team's work on the Twitter Healthy Conversations initiative has also been quite frustrating. This was something that was touted by the platform itself as a major public initiative to bring in independent scholars, right, to assess the platform and share that with the world. It was not until about 8 or 9 months ago that we actually received even access to the public data. And it was only very recently that we got a final no response from the company on some of the non-public data that we had been saying from the very beginning was essential to our work. I firmly believe that we need the Digital Services Act and the sorts of proposals that are contained within that, which Mathias has wonderfully summarized for us, in order to ensure that we really can study these things and that the platforms, right, are held responsible and live up to the promises that they've been making in the public. So now to the work with the European Digital Media Observatory, or EDMO. I am an advisory board member. And in the work that I've been doing there, we quickly identified, just as, essentially simultaneous to Mathias's work, that Article 40 of GDPR was going to be an essential mechanism for us to get past some of the hurdles that we've seen along the way. Because even for us researchers who in some people's eyes, or the way that we talk about data access, may come across as kind of green-eyed monsters, right, looking for just more data, right? As a community, we do take data protection and data privacy very seriously. So it is not that we're out here, hungrily asking to turn over everyone's data to us so we can do with it whatever we want. We have a commitment to taking all of those protections that are laid out in the GDPR quite seriously. And so the Article 40 Code of Conduct provides a very helpful mechanism, a very useful mechanism for us to spell out really from kind of start to finish the steps and the procedures that we need in order to get from data that is held by, processed by the platforms, and access to that in a privacy protecting way for the researchers. So the EDMO in late November announced that it would be considering taking up an initiative to start a working group that would bring a number of stakeholders to the table together in order to actually develop this code of conduct for data access for scientific research. We announced this alongside a call for comments, a consultation period That consultation period ended at the end of the last year. We received a number of very helpful comments from a number of different stakeholders, from civil society to industry to, of course, academics themselves. Taking all of this, useful consultation information together, we have now decided to move forward, and we'll be forming this working group within, we hope that we will be able to announce it in just a matter of weeks. I want to be very clear that this will not be an easy undertaking. They're very, very difficult questions that we have to grapple with. These range from questions about what types of data are appropriate, what types of research questions we should view as falling within the code of conduct. For the various types of data that we would be looking at, some are going to be more sensitive than others, and so we will undoubtedly need to provide a multiplicity of procedures and options for data access. In some instances, we'll need very significant, almost severe rules and procedures for actually getting the data, or perhaps not even having a transfer of data, but access to the data through something like a clean room model, which places all sorts of restrictions on the researchers themselves. But in other cases where the data are less sensitive, there will be other mechanisms that we can use to ensure data access. And so this is going to be a lengthy process. We are bringing, as I said, a number of different stakeholders with very divergent interests, very divergent views on what is possible and appropriate. But I am, given the conversations that I've been having over essentially the last year about the possibility of undertaking this exact action, I'm quite confident that we can come out with something, with a code of conduct itself, that will help ultimately solve this problem for us, right? That will create the clarity we need about how we maintain the standards laid out by GDPR, and yet allow academics to access the data that make it absolutely possible, right? That are fundamental to our ability to investigate and hold the platforms accountable. I'll turn it over now, back to Paddy.
Thank you so much, Rebekah, and thanks for your work as well in this space. Very important, and we all stand to benefit from it. And certainly as very exciting, and also raises many questions, which we'll return to in the Q&A, I think, open for discussion. Before that, we have Bernhard back with us. I think his microphone is working now. Is that right?
Yes, I'm really sorry about this. It's actually my open source browser bailed on me, and I'm now back in the corporate empire, and that seems to work. Yeah.
Welcome back.
I mean, thank you. And thanks a lot for having me. I think I'm going to echo some of the points that Rebekah already made. As Paddy said before, I work in new media studies, which is a very interdisciplinary field where people study all kinds of online phenomena and do so in very different ways, right? We use very different methodologies, from ethnography to computational analysis. And of course, there are very different requirements. In this context, my background is mainly in computational empirical analysis, and I've been building quite a lot of tools over the years for data extraction, for data visualization, and so forth. And I just want to start out by saying a couple of words about why we study platforms and what researchers need to do so. So the first thing I really want to emphasize is that social media platforms, and of course, when we say platforms, we're also talking about other things, but this is, at least for my work, the main focus point, have really become a general purpose technology that affects many different areas of life, right? And that, I think, is a big difference from other regulatory objects and sectors. And that also means that scholars have many different questions, and this has important consequences for the data they need. So when we talk, for example, about misinformation, the focus could be on content and how it intersects with demographics and social connectivity. scholars who look into political campaigning may be interested in observing relevant accounts or pages and what they post and how users react to this. And I mean, more generally, media scholars have been traditionally interested in being able to understand what is out there, what is on offer, what is happening, and that, of course, has become much more complicated in a situation where we don't have a couple of daily newspapers and television stations. So we're often very interested in how content production is organized in terms of actors, institutions, contents, and yeah, this is something that has become much more difficult. Just to give an example, I've recently worked on a project where we try to map YouTube to understand the channel landscape, to get a better understanding what the larger context is for political expression, and also to understand which kind of content reaches people and in what way. And we were able to map 36 million channels, but only because I still had an old access token to YouTube that is a very, very generous means of accessing these data troves, and it would be almost impossible for a new project to replicate this kind of work. And maybe also, if we're interested in studying platform practices, so what platforms themselves are doing, for example, in terms of content moderation, algorithmic filtering, ad placements, those are, again, very, very different data, right? And that means that to a certain degree, the term data access is a bit misleading, or it covers really a wide array of things, some of which do indeed raise privacy concerns, but many others do not. And I think one additional point here is also that there are huge differences between platforms, what we're interested in, how we're interested in it, and so forth. And maybe just to finish this first point, I would also like to argue that behind individual topics like misinformation and algorithmic ordering lies the bigger question how platform life represents a much more fundamental reconfiguration of social relationships and cultural evolution, communicative infrastructures. QAnon, for example, can of course be seen as a relatively contained problem that has to do with propaganda and misinformation, but one can also see it as an effect of much more fundamental changes in our larger media system that we've been seeing over the past decades, even as the emergence of a new social epistemology that has to do with like how culture and knowledge and convictions and opinions are being created. And that, of course, are then questions that are much broader and cannot be easily put into the frame of a data set. So there are a lot of unknowns when it comes to studying platforms. And as Paddy has already mentioned, Jeanette Hoffmann and I have recently been thinking through the term observability about how these broader concerns can be framed conceptually, and how we can think more broadly about how we generate knowledge about platforms and platform lives. And then the second point that I would like to make is maybe a bit more about specific conditions of data access. And I think Mathias and Rebekah have already talked about this. I mean, there are, of course, these two broad access regimes that we're currently seeing. The first one being researchers using developer APIs and web scraping to gather data directly from platforms. And there are some fundamental scientific problems with these techniques, for example, reliability, sample quality, but they have also allowed us to ask relatively broad questions, questions that are not necessarily vetted by the companies themselves, and allow us to put forward the critical research into that space. And over the last years, APIs have been closing, they've been reducing access. And in general, I mean, I've now been developing tools in this sector for about 12 years, and communication has really been very, very bad, right? On my notes, I have the word atrocious, and I don't think that's exaggerated here. Paddy already mentioned the tool NetViz, which was used by hundreds of researchers to gain access to some modicum of platform data, and these tools are particularly important because they allow a broader range of researchers to participate, and not just let's say the computational social scientists that have a strong affinity to working with data. In 2019, NetWiz and other tools were shut down. But I think the most frustrating thing for me about that experience was the extremely low quality of communication, where you get these like one sentence answers from somebody who has obviously not looked into any of the context around that. And we've had similar experiences with Twitter, API keys closing down without warning, without an explanation, without recourse. And even when things work out, it has been difficult. For example, I developed a tool set for studying YouTube, and at one point that was audited by the company, and that process ended with we have no further questions, which is not a very robust statement that we can build on, right? That we can write grant applications for, that we can orient students to do their MA or PhD work on. And I think with scraping, we've seen similar chilling effects. For example, recently, NYU's ad observer project was shut down, and that was in many ways a reaction to the limitation that limitations that Facebook's own ad library system has. Right? They received a cease and desist letter, and now that whole thing, of course, hangs in the air. So this was kind of this first track, and indeed, with initiatives like Social Science 1, we have seen these more bureaucratic or more managed forms of data access emerge. Just this week, Twitter has announced a new API track for academics that on the one side is very promising, right? And particularly when it comes to maybe communication, we're going to make some real steps forward. But then we've also seen already that the data volume that is being made accessible is going to be much lower. Topics will be selected by Twitter and so forth. And I think the same thing has happened in the case of Social Science 1, right? Very restricted topic scope, low data quality, delays, and so forth. So these managed access schemes, I think they're promising on the one side, but I don't think that they can replace other forms of data access that do not require going through more bureaucratic forms. And just to finish, my point here is I hope that both of these axes, right, data access through developer APIs and scraping on the one side, and more managed institutionally embedded forms will continue to exist and will be developed further. Especially when it comes, I think, to asking unfiltered question, right? And being able to react very quickly. So in our work, we've been doing quite a lot of collaborations with journalists where we're not, 2 years after the fact looking into a particular case, but really try to support and collaborate as things happen, and maybe even influence how certain cases unfold positively. The last sentence maybe I would like to add is that I think part of these institutional discussions with actors, we've already heard from Rebekah, for example, and from the European Commission, is that I think a lot of that will have to happen on a per platform basis. And I'm kind of very curious to hear what, in what way one can adapt larger legal regulations or legal proposals to this, I think, necessity to be quite specific when it comes to differentiating different platforms. Thanks.
Thank you, Bernhard, for your contribution. Very stimulating as well. And I like also the distinction between managed forms of access versus maybe programmatic or independent versions. Certainly raised a lot of questions for me, all of your contributions. But before I start firing those off, I'd like to invite you all to respond to each other and take some time to debate. If there are no immediate responses, then I'll prompt you with one, and that is what I'm curious about is we have on the one hand the project under Article 40 for a code of conduct. We also have the new rules in the DSA, and as Mathias said, there will need to be some kind of implementing or guidance needed for Article 31 under the DSA. And how do these two projects relate to each other? And we might also add in the code of practice as another parallel development. Do we see them, do they have synergies? Are they just parallel, separate but equal things? How do we see those things interacting?
Mathias, do you want to start off there, and I can maybe add a few thoughts?
And I think Krisztina has definitely lots of thoughts about this potentially as well, I can imagine. Indeed, like I think, like I was already saying, like the GDPR by itself is already quite complicated, but we're now potentially adding many different other layers of complexity in its relationship, both with the DSA, the Code of Practice on Disinformation, and the European Democracy Action Plan, I think. And I think I think it's important to take into account sort of the timelines of these different initiatives that are currently ongoing. And as I've seen it, and as the Commission has also explained it very well, I think many of the activities that we are currently discussing, especially in the fields of providing access to research data that would help us, for instance, to study better some of the broader disinformation phenomenons or problems related to the dissemination of harmful content, will eventually be dealt with and regulated with by the Digital Services Act, which also has like a very inbuilt separate article on separate codes of conduct, actually. And we now have the Code of Practice on Disinformation, which has already been into force and which is in the process of being renegotiated. And I think there is the fact that this process is ongoing, I think highlights the fact that we as a society and people within the Commission and other policymakers have really stressed the importance of finding interim and intermediary solutions to tackle this problem, actually. So I think we will have a Code of Practice on Disinformation 2.0, which will eventually phase out or transform in one of the codes of conduct that the DSA actually provides room for. And I think on a separate level, you should see the relationship between the ADMO process and the implementing act that the Commission also has already foreseen. I think in the most positive scenario, I think what's going to happen in this ADMO process is a sort of bottom-up approach where you have like the most relevant stakeholders discussing among each other like what actually needs to be done in terms of providing access criteria, figure out like what type of conditions the researchers need to adhere to before they can sort of fit in this category of vetted researchers in the DSA. And so I'd like to think that this work is actually doing already some of the work that the Commission will need to be doing anyway after the DSA actually has been entered into force and implemented. And again, the same sort of mindset is very relevant there. It's sort of like, this is such a pressing problem, and it's better to start now trying to find solutions for that problem, as opposed to wait another, potentially, let's say 3 years until the DSA enters into force, actually. So I think like it's all going to be sort of a little bit of trial and error and finding out like how these different processes are taking place in parallel. There's already by now the sort of infamous mentioning in the European Democracy Action Plan that codes of practice can act as a sort of co-regulatory backstop. I think PhD theses will be written about this in the future by legal scholars. But that's at least how I potentially see these things interacting with each other.
So I would simply add, very much agree with everything that Mathias has said, and add what I think is actually going to, or my hope is that, this will, excuse me, I'm really tripping over myself at the moment, that the code of conduct, the Article 40 code of conduct that we're working on, or that we will be working on, will very helpfully sort out what is one of the most common problems with larger pieces of legislation, with larger pieces of law. And that is ultimately that the devil is in the details always, right? We've seen this with GDPR itself. We can't expect a great deal of clarity on the minutia that are essential to figuring out how these things will work in practice from the legal framework, right, that sets these principles out in the first place. That's why GDPR has the Article 40 within it that allows the possibility for codes of conduct. For the DSA, and even for a code of practice on disinformation, it will be very much the same thing. We'll have large principles that are laid out, but we won't have the sort of nitty-gritty details that get ironed out in those codes or right in the laws themselves. The code of practice, though it will fall under GDPR, I think will allow us to iron out those details in a way that will already answer a number of questions that we could expect to arise in either a code of practice or the Digital Services Act. And the fact that we're going to be bringing a number of different stakeholders who frankly rarely sit in the same room and talk about these things together. We more often than not talk at one another and usually through the media. So actually sitting down, at the figurative table, at least initially while we're, all under COVID lockdown, but ultimately, right, actually being able to talk to one another and talk through these issues, I think is going to pave the way for practical implementation of a code of practice on disinformation and the DSA in a way that we don't often see when such big pieces of law go into effect.
If I may also say a few words, but actually I'm very lucky because my panelists already, I think, gave a very comprehensive answer to this. I just want to really confirm that it is exactly how the Commission also sees this issue. So basically, one of the important issues to keep in mind is indeed the timeline, as Mathias said, that the DSA, till it becomes a legislation and till it enters into force, that will take years. And in this fast-changing and important area that has so much effect on our lives, on our democracies, and also how, for example, we fight COVID-related disinformation, we have to act now. And that's why the Commission, in parallel with the legislative negotiations on the DSA, we are improving basically and strengthening the code of practice. So the idea is indeed, as already also Mathias explained, is that till the DSA, so the legislative anchor, becomes adopted, we already come up with a Code of Practice 2.0 that is a strengthened code of practice, but with the DSA regulatory anchor that is in the DSA, we will make a very big step because we will make the code of practice from a self-regulatory approach to a co-regulatory approach where there are actually sanctions and real powers to enforce it. And I mean, this is a little bit also how this will happen regarding access to research data, that we cannot just wait for the DSA. And the DSA is indeed a very big overarching piece of legislation. And I think that this code of practice on Article 40 of the GDPR can already bring a lot of benefits in the meantime. With the DSA, it can have an even stronger anchor, so to say, but the DSA foresees a very specific way for access to platform data. But I think the code of conduct on that Rebekah explained that they are working can actually also bring a broader help for the overall research community. So I think this is all very complementary, and I think because time is of essence, I think it's important to move fast and open up as much possibilities as possible in the foreseeable future.
Thank you so much. These are very clear answers, I think. So I'd like to return to a point that was made earlier by Bernhard. this distinction between, on the one hand, institutionalized or managed access versus programmatic or independent forms of data access, such as scraping or the use of developer APIs, which are things that are both really kind of feeling the squeeze right now. And I think the question is still open as to whether these kind of more institutionalized forms can provide an alternative. The question I had is that there also seems to be in the DSA and the relevant standards the acknowledgement that this might be part of the solution, right? So in Article 31, there is a subsection which says that ideally data access is granted through APIs. There are also certain other elements in the DSA which refers to API access. And so the question I had for the panel as a whole is whether you see maybe that these forms of access will be accommodated in some way. Can they be regulated in ways that are effective, or instead are we looking more at a data grant type model like we saw with Social Science 1? And for example, as a prompt, the incident we saw with NYU and their scraping project last year, is that something that the new standards in the DSA would protect NYU from, or is that outside the scope?
If I may just say, like, one thing about this, I cannot answer the legal questions in this context then, right. But I really do think that part of that conversation can be a better distinction between which data indeed do pose privacy threats and which don't, right? And I think here institutions can play a more contextual role that isn't necessarily instantly regulation, but hosting conversations about maybe also the limits to publicness or the limits to privacy on the other side, right? So I think not everything in this context is necessarily a question of regulation, since these data interfaces already exist, right? In one way or another, big differences between platforms. Scraping also exists in one way or another, but it's currently either something that is restricted or overused. So there are kind of the two extremes on both sides, and maybe the conversation that Rebekah mentioned before could be part of that, right? And facilitate some of these processes of improvement, if there's no perfection possible.
I can speak a little bit to the question about NYU in particular, because this is something that interestingly merges issues with the platform's own terms and conditions. Ultimately, what Facebook is arguing is that NYU, in the way that it's collected the data for its Ad Observer plugin, violates Facebook's terms of service. Now, of course, they argue that those terms of service are put in place in order to ensure the privacy of users and protect the privacy of users, but it is unclear, right, if this ever came to a more robust legal dispute between the two parties, whether Facebook would turn to US law here. And that's a big question mark as well. Now, in Europe, with the Digital Services Act, what we see in the draft is there's no clear answer to the question of scraping and breaking the platform's terms of service, but that certainly is something that could be clarified. And in the US, there's a lengthy discussion happening right now about the possibility of implementing a safe harbor for researchers, a legal safe harbor for researchers who are meeting privacy standards that would be spelled out in that regulatory framework, but then the platforms would not be able to use their terms of service specifically to enforce against academic researchers who are using scraping methods like NYU did and others certainly are quite frequently. But it's a thorny issue that's still being sorted out on both sides of the ocean at this point.
And I think that example also points to the fact that there are certainly other laws in play besides GDPR or privacy laws that A, might legitimately constrain access, and B, are used by platforms as excuses sometimes, right? So that might also point us towards other areas of interest beside the GDPR in these discussions. Unless there are any other comments on that point, I'd like to turn to some of the questions we're getting in the chat here. So we have one by PD, which is about basically the identity of the researcher. Isn't it discriminatory, and I quote here, isn't it discriminatory towards controllers/processors that do not have research as a purpose to de facto let controllers decide on their own specific safeguards through codes of conduct? So aren't we excluding certain non-scientific researchers by only creating a code of conduct for scientific purposes? And I think, taking that question a step further, what other purposes do we risk excluding here, right? People talk about journalists or NGOs, and so what do we think of this idea of having, how do we define scientists? What do we think of the idea of vetted researchers as it's in DSA?
I mean, I have some opinions about this, and I think it's a very good and a very relevant question. And to a certain extent, I would say like it's almost, unfortunately, because of the way that the GDPR is structured and provides already like very clear exceptions in Article 90 for scientific research, as opposed to, for instance, journalists to a certain extent, that we have the, at the same time, it presents this opportunity now to really dig into sort of like, how can we solve this particular problem for scientific research? And I think like one of the values of this project is that this gets sort of soared as a gold standard that could also be applicable in other fields and for other actors as well, actually. And I think that definitely your point on journalists is resonating very well with me, actually. We have heard now from two leading and distinguished researchers like how difficult it is for academic researchers to get access to that kind of data. But I think some of the top journalists who have been covering, for instance, the misinformation, be it both in the US and in the EU, have lots of problems in having access to very relevant data that would enable some of like the very crucial work that they are doing in holding some of these companies to account for their activities through their publications in the press, or be it through NGO reports, actually. So I think this is sort of like a very first small step, and both the process and the topic is a little bit context dependent, and the code of practice on disinformation and Article 89 and the specific provisions for scientific research provide us very specific opportunities now to move this topic further, but that doesn't mean indeed that we shouldn't be mindful of how this could also affect this for a less privileged set of actors than independent academics, actually.
And I would add there that this is a very serious concern for the EDMO as well, because the Digital Media Observatory just to be a repository of information and data for academic researchers, but for journalists and for members of civil society who have, valid claim to be researching, investigating these very same issues. But as Mathias has laid out, we have a framework in place that, to some extent, and for reasons that I think are valid, effectively privileges scientific research in this space. So, we can, and adding on to some of the things that Mathias was talking about, there's also the benefit that academic researchers are embedded within institutions, right, that themselves can be tied to, any sort of framework that might create responsibilities, right, requirements for the researchers, and institutions that themselves have data protection officers, right, who are who can review these very matters themselves. So it's not that I think that this is the final step by any means, but I think it's an important, it's an essential first step. And I would say that, you know, more than just being able to use this as a guidepost for how we would create similar regimes for other types of actors like journalists and so on, it also creates opportunities for academics to work with journalists and civil society organizations in order to investigate these common interests together.
If I may only add one comment to that, because I think, yeah, that's something that we've been doing quite a bit, collaborating with journalists. And I just again want to underscore that, you know, a certain openness in data streams does exist in certain contexts, right? I think Twitter still has its streaming API as we speak. YouTube still gives quite a bit of data access, although the volume has been really reduced over the years, right? And these schemes are schemes that can also be used by journalists, particularly when it comes to really, topics that are very current, right? Where hours count, and it would be very hard to imagine a filtered process in that kind of context. So I think, of course, you know, researchers are complaining quite a bit, but I think we should also highlight that quite some research is still possible, and strengthening that, I think, would also help other members of civil society to fulfill watchdog functions, report, and so forth.
And I would love to continue this discussion because I think this is a very good point. We are nearing the end of our time here. I'm not sure what will happen at 10 past, whether it'll just cut off or not. But I will attempt one last question from the Q&A, which is from, and I quote, an interested person. It's phrased a bit provocatively, but I think it's something we addressed a bit already, which is the idea that the disinformation code of practice hasn't really proven to be effective. And so what is different this time around that leads us to have greater confidence, and what are the differences, the better safeguards we have in place? I think Krisztina already talked about that briefly, but I'd like to end on a positive note, so this might be a good one to discuss.
Yes, so if you allow me, I would like to say a couple of words, because indeed, I mean, admittedly, when we assess the functioning of the code of practice and on this information, because here we are often speaking about two codes of practices, we have pointed to certain shortcomings, but we have also pointed to the points that it managed to improve. And let me stress that this code of practice on disinformation is a first one in the entire world. And this information is also not a very easy topic to address, because we are not more often than not, we are not in the domain of illegal content. And that is a particularly difficult area to address, in particular also in view of the careful balance with the freedom of expression. So that's why I think that the self-regulatory code of practice that we have already established and that is working is a very good first step, and we should be proud about that. We acknowledge from the Commission side that this is not enough, in particular in view of the increasing challenges that this information poses for our societies. That's why in the guidance, the Commission will point out which areas should be strengthened. But again, this is for the time being a self-regulatory code of practice with positive sides, that it has been very fast in bringing results, and the negative sides or the shortcomings that it is self-regulation. However, with the DSA, we will move to the next level, having a regulatory anchor, and in the meantime we can also strengthen it. But again, let's often not forget this area, and that's why the DSA certainly will bring a lot of support for the disinformation area, but it is also always to be kept in mind that here we are not in the simple domain about, okay, this is hate speech, this is copyright infringement, this is child pornography, so you take it down. No, here this is much more complex, and that's why often it's not so easy to find good responses, but I think the code of practice can bring good results, and coupled with the research community's efforts that we hope can be had by the code of practice on Article 40, I think we are really on the right path to move this ahead.
Yes, and I think the clear signals that we're getting from the European Commission here are also encouraging to the researchers who, with these strictly voluntary measures, have been so often left frustrated or disappointed. And that, I think, is what makes it really different this time around, that there's this horizon of fairly binding rules ahead of us. And in the run-up to that, we have more bargaining power, but also we see there's an experiment in the run-up to what's to come with the DSA. So I think we're at time here. I want to thank again these excellent panelists for their contributions today and their contributions in future when we can all reap the benefits of the data they will make available to us. So thanks again to everyone involved, and I hope to stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paddy. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.